Somewhere tonight, a stranger is checking into a hotel with the name Hilton glowing above the entrance. Maybe it's an airport hotel, grabbed at midnight after a delayed flight. Maybe it's a beach resort someone saved 3 years to afford. There are more than 8,000 of these buildings, scattered across 138 countries, on nearly every skyline worth naming. Here's the part almost nobody believes the first time they hear it. The Hilton family doesn't own a single one of them. Not the buildings, not the company, not even the brand stamped across the awnings. If you traced the money all the way to the top, you would not find a Hilton sitting there collecting a check. You'd find charity. That's not a story about a family losing its grip on a fortune through bad luck or bad decisions. There's no scandal here, no wasted inheritance, no black sheep who gambled the family name away. What happened to the Hiltons is stranger than a collapse, because it wasn't an accident. It was a plan executed twice by 2 different men 40 years apart. And by the end of this, you'll understand why some of the richest families in American history did something that looks, on the surface, like throwing it all away. The man built it. Conrad Hilton was born on Christmas Day, 1887, in a small adobe town in the New Mexico Territory, before New Mexico was even a state. His father ran the local general store, and young Conrad worked the counter, hauled freight, and helped rent out spare rooms in the family home to travelers passing through on the railroad. Couple of dollars a night, meals included. Look closely at that detail, because it's the whole story in miniature. Decades before he owned a single hotel, Conrad Hilton was already doing the job. Give a tired stranger a clean bed and treat them like they matter. His first real hotel wasn't even a hotel he set out to buy. In 1919, he traveled to Cisco, Texas, in the middle of an oil boom, planning to purchase a bank. The deal fell through. Down the street was a rundown building called the Mobley, so overcrowded that men were sleeping in shifts because there weren't enough beds. Conrad bought the hotel instead, because the hotel was printing money and the bank wasn't going anywhere near him. From that single building, an empire began to take shape, one property at a time, riding the boom years of the 1920s straight up. Then the floor fell out from under the entire country. Few people remember how close Conrad Hilton came to losing everything in the Great Depression. A business built on travelers is a business with no customers when nobody can afford to travel. And his hotels emptied out fast. He went millions of dollars into debt. There are stories of him borrowing pocket change from a hotel bellman just to get through the week. For a stretch of years, his creditors effectively owned him. He clawed his way back one property at a time, and he came out the other side of the 1930s harder, more careful, and permanently changed by how close he'd come to ruin. That brush with losing everything would shape not just how he ran his business for the next 4 decades. It would shape how he thought about money itself, and eventually how he thought about what to do with it after he was gone. By the 1940s and 50s, Hilton was collecting trophies. The Stevens Hotel in Chicago, the largest hotel in the world at the time, the Palmer House, and in 1949 the prize he'd wanted since he was young, the Waldorf Astoria in New York, a hotel he'd once carried a photograph of folded in his wallet, years before he could ever afford to dream about owning it. He planted the Hilton flag overseas, opening the first grand American hotel in post-war Europe. A project he talked about almost like a piece of Cold War diplomacy, American comfort as a kind of soft weapon to win hearts abroad. By the time he was finished, Hilton was the largest hotel company on the planet, and Conrad Hilton himself had become something bigger than a businessman. He was a walking symbol of the American story, the store clerk from a dusty nowhere town who built an empire that touched 6 continents. He even wrote a memoir about it called Be My Guest, 3 words that doubled as his entire philosophy of life. That's the empire. Now here's the question that should stop you cold. How does a man build all of that and then leave his own children almost nothing? The foundation nobody noticed. Back in 1944, years before anyone could have guessed how large the Hilton empire would grow, Conrad quietly started a charitable foundation. At the time, it barely registered as news. Rich men started charities all the time. It was almost a formality, a tax-friendly hobby that sat in the background of a busy life. This one wasn't a hobby. It was the seed of everything that would come later. Conrad built it years before his own family understood what it was actually for, and he gave it one job: relieve the suffering of the distressed and destitute, wherever they were, with no boundary drawn by religion, race, or nationality. Not his bloodline, not his name, just people who were struggling anywhere on earth. Over the following decades, Conrad rewrote his will again and again. And there's a pattern in those rewrites that tells you everything about where his head was going. With nearly every new version, the share set aside for his own family shrank a little more, and the share earmarked for the foundation grew. This wasn't a man who forgot to provide for his children. This was a man who spent 35 years, on purpose, arranging not to. Why? Because Conrad had come to believe something that most wealthy families spend enormous energy pretending isn't true: that handing your children a fortune doesn't protect them. It can hollow them out. He'd watched it happen to other rich families up close, heirs with nothing left to fight for because every problem in their life had already been solved by someone else's money. He wrote that conviction directly into his will, not as a footnote, but almost as a sermon, page after page insisting that charity was the highest duty a person owes, and that wealth belongs to the suffering of before it belongs to a family name. The will that shocked everyone. Conrad Hilton died in January 1979, at 91 years old. When his will was finally read, it turned out to be exactly what 4 decades of quiet rewrites had been building toward, and the numbers are worth saying slowly. The estate was valued at more than $200 million. The Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, the same charity he'd founded 35 years earlier, was set to receive more than 99% of it. Everything left for his 2 surviving sons, his daughter, his grandchildren, and a handful of others added up to less than $1.75 million combined. Each grandchild received $15,000, about the price of a car in 1979. The rest of a $200 million fortune went to charity. Picture being one of those grandchildren. You grew up carrying the most famous name in the hotel business, watching it lit up on skylines around the world. Then the will is read, and you learn the man who built all of it left you barely a rounding error, and handed the empire to a foundation instead. One of Conrad's sons was never going to accept that quietly. The son fought back. Barron Hilton wasn't a distant heir living off an allowance. Spent his career inside the business, building the carte blanche credit card into a real company, and even co-founding a professional football team on the side, taking an early ownership stake in the Los Angeles Chargers before selling out years later to focus on hotels. When the will handed almost the entire empire to charity, Barron went looking for a crack in it. He won. Buried in Conrad's will was a provision granting Barron an option to purchase a large block of Hilton stock directly from the estate, stock that made up nearly the entire inheritance promised to the foundation. On paper, it read like a mechanism to keep the family's hand near the wheel, so no outside charity board would end up running Conrad's hotel company. In practice, Barron used it to fight his way back into control of the empire his father had just tried to sign away. That triggered three-way legal war. Barron wanted control. The foundation wanted the shares it had been promised. And the IRS was circling the estate at the same time, fighting over hundreds of millions in estate taxes. The fight dragged on for the better part of a decade, grinding through the California courts until 1988, when an appeals court finally sided with Barron and upheld his right to exercise the option. When the resulting settlement was carved up, Barron walked away with roughly 4 million shares outright. Another 3.5 million went to the foundation, and about 6 million more went into a special trust, a charitable remainder unit trust, where Barron would collect the income from the shares during his lifetime, while the shares themselves were promised to the foundation once he died. All told, the settlement left Barron controlling roughly 34% of Hilton Hotels' voting power. The son had fought his father's will and won a real piece of the empire back. In almost any other family story, that's the ending: the heir prevails, the name and the fortune stay together. This is the part where the Hilton story should have looked just like every other dynasty tale. It didn't stay that way for long. 20 years at the top, and then Christmas. For the next 2 decades, Barron ran Hilton and grew it into something even bigger than what he'd fought to control. Under him, the company went public, spun off its casino and gaming operations into a separate business, and pushed the international footprint his father had started decades earlier into new markets across the globe. A founder's creation had become a modern global corporation, and Barron sat at the top of it. By any ordinary measure, he'd won, and won big. Then, in 2007, near the peak of a private equity boom, when buyout firms were paying record prices for trophy companies, Barron and the Hilton board agreed to sell the entire company to the private equity giant Blackstone. The deal valued Hilton at roughly $26 billion, a steep premium over where the stock had been trading. In a single transaction, the empire Conrad Hilton had spent 60 years building, and that Barron had spent a decade in court fighting to control, stopped being a Hilton company at all. It became an asset inside a Wall Street portfolio run out of a Manhattan office by people who had never met a Hilton in their lives. The name stayed on the buildings because the name itself was worth money to license. The ownership walked out the door. That split says everything about what the family actually still had at that point. The most valuable thing left wasn't the buildings or the balance sheet. It was 3 syllables on a sign. If that had been the end of the story, it would already be strange enough. It wasn't the end. That same year, 2007, just months after selling the company for $26 billion, Barron Hilton, then in his late 70s, made an announcement on Christmas Day. He would leave roughly 97% of his own fortune, an estate later valued by Bloomberg at around $2.3 billion, to the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, the exact same foundation he had spent 10 years suing. The exact same instrument his father had used to disinherit his generation in the first place. Read that twice, because it's the hinge the entire story turns on. The man who fought in court for a decade to escape his father's will spent the final chapter of his own life quietly rebuilding it and aiming it squarely at his own children and grandchildren. Barron pledged an immediate $1.2 billion, drawn from the proceeds of the Hilton sale, into a trust bound for the foundation, with the rest to follow after his death. The gift was set to roughly double the foundation's endowment, pushing it from about $2.9 billion toward more than $6 billion, making Barron its single largest donor. His timing lined up with a broader shift already stirring among American billionaires. A few years later, that movement would get a name: the Giving Pledge. Barron signed it. He framed his decision in almost the same language his father had used generations earlier: the conviction that money does more good working on the world's problems than sitting quietly in a family trust. Whether that came from genuine belief or from the old man's argument finally winning out from beyond the grave, the outcome landed the same either way. What was left for the next generation, the grandchildren who carried the Hilton name into the new century, was the final 3%, split on roughly 24 relatives. The heiress who wasn't. For years, the public looked at a certain Hilton granddaughter and saw the picture of a billion-dollar heiress, the assumed future owner of a global hotel fortune. That was the image sold in magazines and gossip columns. Behind the scenes, the math told a completely different story. Grandpa had already pledged 97% of his own fortune to charity. That famous granddaughter and her generation weren't dividing up a hotel empire. They were dividing the leftovers of the leftovers, a relatively modest inheritance split among about 20 relatives. The billion-dollar heiress image the public believed in was, financially speaking, a costume. The real inheritance had already been signed away, years before anyone ever picked up a tabloid. Barron Hilton died in September 2019, at 91 years old, the same age his own father had been when he died. And just like his father, he kept his word. The overwhelming majority of what he owned went to the foundation, exactly as promised. 2 generations of Hilton men, the founder and his son, looked at their own families and arrived at the identical decision. Not you, the foundation. Why would anyone do this twice? The easy explanation is spite, or some private family grudge, and there's no question there was real friction in this story. But spite doesn't hold up as the actual reason, and if you stop there, you miss the entire lesson buried in it. The real explanation is a belief, and it's one of the oldest arguments about money in American history. Conrad Hilton believed, down to his bones, that a great fortune dropped directly onto the next generation doesn't bless them, it rots them. He'd watched it happen to other wealthy families, heirs with no drive left, because life had never handed them a single problem they actually had to solve themselves. He decided the most useful thing his money could do wasn't sit in a trust fund with his name stamped on it. It was go to work on the suffering of people who would never meet a single Hilton in their lives. Barron, the son who fought that very idea for a decade in court, appears to have landed on the exact same conclusion by the end of his own life. He had the money. He had the name. He chose the foundation anyway. This idea is older than the Hiltons. Back in 1889, the steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, a widely debated essay called The Gospel of Wealth, arguing that a rich man's true responsibility is to give his fortune away within his own lifetime, to libraries, schools, and public institutions, rather than simply dumping it on his children and mistaking that for love. Carnegie practiced exactly what he preached, giving away the bulk of his steel fortune to fund public libraries across the country. Conrad Hilton was born into the world Carnegie had been arguing with, and he built his entire will around that same conviction. Look at the biggest fortunes of that era, and you'll see the same pattern again and again. Rockefeller money built a foundation that's still funding work today. Ford money did the same. Carnegie's libraries are still standing in towns across America, more than a century after the man who paid for them died. The industrialists, whose fortunes actually outlasted them, didn't hand the whole pile to their children and hope for the best. They built machines specifically designed to give the money away and pointed those machines at the public instead of the bloodline. What actually happened here? There's a popular version of this story that people love to tell, and it's wrong in almost every detail. People say the Hiltons lost their fortune. They didn't. Nobody misplaced $200 million. Nobody drank it away or gambled it at a table or got swindled out of it by a con man. There's no drunk grandson, no forged signature, no crooked business partner who vanished with the accounts. The tired old story about a third generation burning down what the first generation built simply doesn't apply here. People also assume the family must still quietly own Hilton, collecting checks behind the scenes from all 8,000 properties. They don't. The company was sold to Blackstone in 2007, taken public again a few years later, and today trades on the New York Stock Exchange as a publicly held company with no controlling Hilton stake whatsoever. The family doesn't own it. They away. Every popular version of this story gets the direction wrong. The Hiltons didn't lose their fortune. They released it, deliberately with lawyers in writing across 2 generations. Who won? Follow the money all the way to where it landed, and the answer isn't at all. It's the Conrad Hilton Foundation. Today, the foundation holds $7.4 billion in assets, making it one of the largest private foundations in the United States. Over its history, it has given away more than $3.6 billion, distributing roughly $300 million every single year. That money funds work that has nothing to do with hotels, clean water access in the developing world, housing for people coming out of homelessness, support for foster children out of the system with nowhere to go, disaster relief, and support for Catholic sisters running hospitals and schools in some of the poorest regions on Earth. That single foundation gives more money in 1 year than most wealthy families manage to hold on to across an entire century. And it's been doing that year after year for decades. 80 years after Conrad Hilton quietly founded it in 1944, the foundation is still running, still growing, still writing checks. The name is on the hotels, the money is the foundation. And the foundation is exactly where both men aimed it from the very beginning. The lesson. Here's the part worth carrying with you, whether or not you'll ever have a fortune to pass down yourself. We like to tell ourselves that rich families lose their money because the children turn out spoiled and careless. Sometimes that's exactly what happens. But the biggest, most durable fortunes in American history didn't survive by getting passed hand to hand from father to son. They survived by getting pulled out of the family entirely and locked inside something the next generation couldn't touch, couldn't sell, and couldn't fight over. A foundation. A trust. Some structure built around a mission, standing in the exact spot where a bloodline used to be. Conrad Hilton figured that out and spent 35 years and a lifetime of will rewrites building it. His son fought that very idea for 10 years in court, won the fight completely, and then surrendered to the same conclusion anyway, by his own choice, at the end of his life. In the end, the Hiltons kept the one thing their founder actually wanted them to have. Not hotels. Not the $200 million. Not the $26 billion company either. Just the name. Tonight, 8,000 hotels will light up the word Hilton across 138 countries. And the family that gave the world that name won't collect a single dollar from any one of them. That was never the tragedy at the center of this story. That was the design.